Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another top 10 Survivor ranking. Again, continuing on this series where I talk about my top 10 players at certain time periods across Survivor history. Now at this point I've done one for before Survivor All-Stars, I did one for after Survivor Micronesia, and this will be a sequel video to that. This time talking about my thoughts on the top 10 players after Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, which despite there only being 4 seasons in between the periods talked about in my previous list and this list, there are actually a decent amount of changes. Like while the main list only has a few new entries, the overall placements are radically different from what they were on the previous list, largely due to Heroes vs. Villains obviously having a major factor on my opinion of certain players. Now, like my previous video, we will be going through the honorable mentions first, including the group of players that are not on the list from that previous list. So with that, let's talk about who is not there anymore. First up, the person who was at 10th place on my last list was Ethan Zahn, who again got bumped simply because other people moved up. Again, my opinion on Ethan Zahn would not have changed at this point. Obviously, he hadn't played since All-Stars. So again, nothing really changes there in terms of him. It's more so that my opinion of other players would have gone up. So again, he didn't make the list. Also off the list now is Boston Rob. And again, this is in a position where this is the 3rd time Boston Rob plays in Heroes vs. Villains. And I will say that my opinion of Boston Rob as a player probably actually goes up after Heroes vs. Villains. The problem is that, again, other players go up more. Where, like, I do think Heroes vs. Villains shows that, again, he is once again able to hold control of a tribe, with him pretty much being the figurehead of the Villains tribe up until the Tyson boat out. And while I do think there are definitely points where he would have been in danger moving forward in the game, even if the Tyson vote hadn't happened, where I do think for sure Tyson would have eventually turned on Rob, and it would have been easy to get Jerry on board with that as well. So again, it's not like he was in a great position. I do feel like the fact that he was able to display that his style of gameplay was effective once again, at least for the short term, I think would have boosted my opinion of him. But again, not quite enough to be in the top 10. And the other person now off the list is Chris Doherty, who, again, is still very close to the list. I mean, at this point, he's probably number 11. And I think if I were to do this now, I would actually put him above some people that didn't make it on the list. But again, at this point in Survivor history, Chris didn't quite make the list. Now, for the rest of the honorable mentions, these are people who played either for the first time after Survivor Micronesia, or were on Heroes vs. Villains. In my opinion, of their games went up through Heroes vs. Villains, but again, not enough to make it into the top 10. I guess we'll start off with Gabon, and to be honest, there's not really much to talk about from Gabon. Again, you obviously have Kenny and Maddie, who I think were probably the 2 better players on the season, but I think they both still are not even close to reaching the top 10 here. Like, it is kind of humorous how, again, I don't think there's a single above average player on Gabon. It really is a cast of mostly mediocre players, with Kenny and Maddie seeming like the best, but even then, they're very flawed players in their own right. I also did very much consider Steven Fishback from Token Jeans, who, again, is hovering around the list, but I do think at this point in Survivor history, like before Survivor Cambodia, which kind of solidifies my opinion on his game. Again, I feel like there's a bit of haziness for me with his game, and also, realistically, he's kind of still around the same spot that I would have like a Rob Cesternino, who is also not on this list. So again, Steven didn't quite make it. From Samoa, the only honorable mention here is the winner of the season in Natalie White. Just didn't really make the list here. Again, to me, not an active enough player to quite make the top 10, so it didn't make it on. And then again, from Heroes vs. Villains, a couple people that my opinion of them went up, but not enough to be on the list. I mean, first up, we got Rupert, who, again, showed for a 3rd time he can make a deep run on a season, and he probably pulls off one of his better strategic moves in terms of him faking out Russell into thinking he has an idol, which causes them to split the votes and leads him surviving the final 8 round. Again, that's good gameplay there, but I mean, at the end of the day, not enough to be top 10. And the other person is someone that has their first actually good game on Heroes vs. Villains, and that is Jerry. Again, Jerry plays a solid game on Heroes vs. Villains. Now, I do think she struggles with winning in the scenario that she was trying to go to the end with. Again, she was trying to get to the end with Sandra and Russell, which I think just leads to Sandra winning, but she still had a winning scenario in her getting with Parvati and Russell. And I think just overall, I think she did a much better job at navigating through the game. Obviously, I mean, it's her deepest run in history of the show, but again, it is a solid run, but not quite enough to be top 10, especially when she had 2 relatively mediocre performances before that, and even this one not even being like a top tier game at the end of the day. So again, not quite making it on the list. But there we go. I mean, those are all the honorable mentions. Now let's get into the top 10. And again, as I mentioned before, Heroes vs. Villains had a major impact on this top 10, with 7 of the people in this top 10 being people that were on Heroes vs. Villains. And through that, a lot of placements got juggled around here, even though, again, also 7 of the 10 are also people that were on the previous list as well. But again, I think it'll be fun to talk through what changed in that time. But before we get to that, the bottom 2 people on the list here are actually both people new to the list. And let's start off at number 10. At number 10, we do have a very controversial figure at this point in Survivor history. Really, I guess ever in Survivor history. But at number 10, we do have Russell HANTZ, who again barely makes the list for me here. I mean, obviously Russell HANTZ at this point in Survivor history was well renowned and talked about as one of the best players of all time by a majority of the fan base. Like, obviously there was the minority talking about how he's a terrible player because he can't win a jury vote and like all this other stuff. But I do feel like the majority of the audience was very high on Russell at this point. And again, for me, like, I do think he does have 2 impressive seasons back to back. The fact that he was able to get to the end of the game on 2 back-to-back seasons is kind of insane, especially one of those seasons being Heroes vs. Villains. Mind you, he obviously has the advantage of no one knowing who he was coming into Heroes vs. Villains. But I think to me, that's even more indicative of him being able to get to the end on a newbie season where no one knows who he is more of the time. And now, without the context of obviously us seeing him on Redemption Island, which obviously lowers my opinion of him, and then seeing him again on Australian Survivor and do the exact same thing, which also lowers my opinion on him, I do feel like without those factors in, like, Russell barely squeaks on to the top 10 here. Or again, he is an extremely dominant figure, a figure that is able to take control of his alliance and do a lot of impressive strategic maneuvers in order to get his alliance in the majority. I mean, his Samoa game, he's able to successfully use an idol to save his group at 11, followed by flipping over Shambo and John Fincher at 10 to take out Laura Moret, and then follow that up with blindsiding Fincher, and at that point has full control over the game. But even with that, he does have some faulty moments. Again, the way he treats Monica on her way out, the way he treats Brett on his way out is very faulty, and obviously he does have a jury that is very upset at him by the end. But again, just the way that he was able to maneuver through the game is still very impressive to me there. And the same thing goes with Heroes vs. Villains, where yes, I do think he has a flaw early on. The fact that he does attach himself to Parvati, someone that is the clear target, and through that makes himself a target as well. The way that he was able to maneuver through the game after he saves Parvati at the Tyson vote is pretty incredible as well. Now again, the Tyson vote I think is very wonky on how much credit to really give him there. Where yes, I do think there is some impressive elements to Russell's game and him getting Tyson to think that he was willing to work with him, but I also think it was very luck dependent, where I don't think this is a situation where Russell tricked Tyson into voting for Parvati. I think Tyson made that decision on his own, but some of that was propelled by him thinking that Russell was more so on his side. But again, like, I think there's a level of credit to give him there, but I think his gameplay from that point forward is impressive from a positioning standpoint. Again, like, he is able to flip Jerry to take out Boston Rob, takes full control of his tribe at that point, while, like, yes, he does, again, make faulty decisions with that control, with him taking out Coach and then allowing Sandra to make it as far as she does in a position where she's actively trying to take him out. You have him getting rid of Danielle, completely burning his last semblance of any winning chance of him getting to a final 3 with Danielle and Parvati. But again, still, like, along the way, he does have impressive maneuvers. He flips over Candace to secure himself at the final 9. Again, his maneuver of actually flipping over Jerry to vote out Danielle is still impressive in its own right. But obviously, Heroes vs. Villains is probably the biggest example of his poor jury management as well, particularly with Rupert, where the one scene of him saying, "You're a dumbass, Rupert," is probably the worst display of jury management in the history of the show. Again, I do think Russell inherently has his flaws. However, I do feel like at this point in Survivor history, he played 2 extremely dominant games back to back, which is really insane and really unprecedented at this point in Survivor history, where, like, even with someone like an Amanda, who also went back to back, didn't have as much control in the game as Russell did across these seasons, and nearly as much agency as Russell did across the seasons. So again, for me, that's enough to land him here at number 10, despite definitely some hesitancies with his overall approach to the game. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that I've talked about many times in the past about how I'm not super high on this person as a player, but after Heroes vs. Villains, they still would have been in my top 10 above Russell here. At number 9, we do have Sandra. And again, at this point, Sandra just became the first 2-time winner in the history of Survivor. And that is an impressive stat in its own right. For me, still, the issue is how she won both of her seasons. Mind you, again, Pearl Islands is more playable to me. Like, yes, she is in danger early on and gets saved by her tribe not going to tribal. And she does have a very easy win against Lil, to which she actually still sabotages herself to where her own bad answer ends up giving Lil the jury vote there. It's like, at the end of the day, to me, it's still like a fine game. To me, I still think Heroes vs. Villains Sandra is a really bad winning game. Again, to me, it's one where she still like pretty much succeeds and wins in the game because she fails at almost everything she's trying to do. I mean, the only thing she actively does successfully over the course of the season is trick Russell into taking out Coach. But outside of that, I feel like she mostly just fails at what she's trying to do in getting rid of Russell, what she tries to do from very early on and is never able to do so. Even at the merge, she gets outplayed by Russell to where the heroes believe Russell over Sandra. And then at the final 9, Russell undercuts Sandra by taking away her position as a swing vote by flipping over Candace. Like, while people like to point out, like, oh, she outplayed Russell by getting him to vote out Coach. I mean, to me, Russell outplays Sandra way more than Sandra outplays him. But obviously a massive difference here is how Sandra is able to manage jury. And I think Sandra obviously does a much better job in managing the Heroes vs. Villains jury and really playing up this element of that, like, you should have listened to me about Russell, which really allows her to gain a lot of sympathy with the jury. Plus also the fact that she had some positive pre-existing relationships, unlike someone like a Parvati who had pre-existing relationships, but most of them negative. And Russell, who built his own negative relationships along the way. But still, again, to me, like, Sandra still has a faulty game both of her times, particularly her Heroes vs. Villains appearance. However, at this point in Survivor history, with less players to rank than the modern day, and also without the massive misstep in Winners at War, again, for me, Sandra barely makes the list here. Again, I have a lot of holes with her game, but again, she has won twice. And while I feel like there is inconsistency in her overall gameplay style, again, it is enough to land her here at number 9. Now, number 8, another person from Heroes vs. Villains, someone that actually got bumped down a spot since the last list. But to be honest, Heroes vs. Villains probably like solidified my opinion of them as a player. And that person is Amanda, who again, like, for me, Heroes vs. Villains really just added to the consistency of Amanda's game. While Amanda did come into the season with a pretty big target on her back and does get voted for in the first few tribals, she's still able to survive that despite that. And is still able to make a pretty deep run. So despite her coming into this season in a bad spot, she still makes it all the way to final 9, which again very much screams out to me just how consistent of a player she really is. Again, she further cements herself as a solid all-around player here as well. Like, while she does still have some negatives to her game, particularly around like how I don't think she's the greatest liar in the world, which obviously gets pointed out during Heroes vs. Villains, I still think she is a, again, strong physical competitor, wins a decent amount of challenges, strong enough socially to where she's a very playable figure in the cast, and then also has a decent enough strategic mind, probably one of the better strategic thinkers on the Heroes tribe. Like, again, to me, Amanda is a very solid all-around player that, through her 3 appearances, continuously went up in my estimations. But, again, it's still not enough to crack the upper echelon, especially when 6 of the remaining 7 players on this list are winners of the show. So, because of that, for me, Amanda ends up landing here at number 8. Now, number 7, again, someone that did get bumped down a bit, getting usurped by one player on the previous list, and then also having a new addition bump him down. So at number 7, we do have Todd. And again, Todd's right above Amanda. Again, for me, despite Amanda playing 3 times, showing how consistent she was, and we obviously just saw Todd outplay Amanda in China, to the point where I always felt like Todd was the better player of the two. Like, while again, I do have some questions on how consistent of a game he can really play and how he would play as an underdog, I do feel solidly that Todd is a better player than Amanda. And because of that, he is automatically above Amanda here. But again, like, for me, 2 other players that played on Heroes vs. Villains. But again, for me, Heroes vs. Villains does end up knocking him down a bit, largely due to other people moving up. Again, obviously, my opinion on Todd's game doesn't go down from that short time span, and even to the modern day, like, I still have a similar opinion of Todd's game. It's just that at this point, these other players have more credibility to their games, with more proof backing their games than Todd does. So again, I still look at him as one of the most strategically aggressive players in the history of the show up until this point. I still look at him as one of the better strategic thinkers just in general across Survivor at this point. And I do think his winning game is a very impressive one, and that is why he's here at number 7. Now, number 6, kind of a similar thing, though this person did actually get bumped down quite a bit, with this person actually being number 2. So there are actually 3 people below him on the previous list that moved ahead of him, and then also another new person moving ahead of him. So at number 6, we do have Yule. And again, for me, this is a consequence of, again, Heroes vs. Villains bumped other people up, while Yule didn't get to play on Heroes vs. Villains, and because that, he just like kind of naturally falls back down. Now, I will say between him and the next person we'll be talking about, I do think it is pretty close, with me having more faith in Yule's like strategic ability than really anyone in the history of Survivor up until this point. But again, for me, it's like we only saw 1 season's worth. He didn't really face that much adversity outside of the final 9 round to make him feel like that consistent of a player to me, or at least as consistent as the next few people we'll be talking about, or at least as consistent as some of the people that bumped ahead of him. But again, for me, it is very close between him and the next person we'll be talking about. And to be honest, I think if this was even a few seasons later, I would probably actually switch these 2 spots. But I do think the next person we'll be talking about was riding on a bit of a high after Heroes vs. Villains that would have put him above Yule here. But again, for me, Yule is still a very solid all-around player with such an expertise in the strategy of the game. But again, one that we only have 1 appearance from, and that's why he's here at number 6. Now, number 5, again, person I bumped up above Yule, but again, I feel like part of that is because at the time I would have been very impressed by his Heroes vs. Villains appearance, and that person is Tom Westman. Now, I talked about my opinion on his pullout game in the last video, where it's like, it's a weird one. It's a weird one where he shows that he's a very solid all-around player, but I just didn't know how consistent that game would be. And Heroes vs. Villains doesn't really add to the consistency. Obviously, he is still relatively boot here, but also comes into the season with a massive target on his back. And despite that target, he's still able to pull off some moves along the way, particularly the CIRIE blind side, which I would give more credit to JT for, but I still think Tom deserves some of the credit there. Obviously, he does fine in idle. He does really scramble during this portion of the game, and in kind of a similar sense to how I thought about Ethan after All-Stars. Again, I feel like my opinion on Tom goes up because of that, because we're seeing how hard he plays while on the bottom, and while he doesn't end up being successful, I do think it is overall a net positive for my opinion of him as a player. And again, I feel like immediately after Heroes vs. Villains, really riding on this high, I would have put him above Yule. But again, for me, it's very, very close. Again, obviously, I think Tom is a much better overall physical competitor than Yule is. While not being as good strategically, but still being no slouch either. I think Tom is also a solid strategic competitor. Again, I feel like at this point in Survivor history, I would have more faith in Tom to do well in any given appearance. Though, I feel like that's an opinion that would change over time. But again, for now, I do have Tom here at number 5. Now, number 4, the last one-time player on the list here, the person who was at number 1 on my previous list, we do have Earl Cole. And again, situation of other players playing again that caused him to get bumped down, because we have more proof for these other players than with Earl. Again, I even talked about this in my last video, that again, that's the hesitancy of putting Earl at number 1, is just how I do feel like there's a lack of information of how he would do without the things that benefited him on Fiji. Again, on Fiji, he did have some things that wouldn't have happened on any other given season. Things like him having the ability to create this Black Alliance. That, again, wouldn't have been an easy thing to do until modern seasons. Outside of Cook Islands and Fiji, you also have the builders versus explorers element of it that allowed him to easily flip over the swap tribe into his favor, which again, that was also based around how the game started, where everyone started on one camp, which again would not have been a thing on any given season. So again, there are things to point out here of we just have lack of evidence of exactly how Earl would play on any given season, but he does play a near flawless game outside of that. That does put him as high as he is here, because again, I do think there is a lot of impressive elements of Earl's game. But with that lack of evidence, and then also now 3 other players to me that have a lot more evidence. It's just not enough to support Earl being number 1 anymore, and because he drops down to number 4. Now number 3. Now we're on to someone that jumped up quite a bit, jumped up 3 spots here, leaped ahead of Earl, Tom, Yule, and Todd, only being bumped down a spot by a new player added to the list. But at number 3, we do have CIRIE. And again, I've talked about this in my last video. To me, CIRIE, while Heroes vs. Villain was not the greatest overall performance for her, to me, it really just continues to solidify my opinion of CIRIE being a very strong player, with her, again, consistently getting screwed over despite being in strong positions. Again, she had a very impressive game in Panama to where she really gets taken out in the fire-making challenge, largely due to the fact that Terry had an idol. That made it so she had to go to fire against Danielle. Micronesia, she pretty much wins the game, had it not been for the fact that the James medevac happened, which caused them to add another round to the game, which caused them to have a final 2 instead of a final 3. And here in Heroes vs. Villains, like, while this is easily her least impressive of the 3 appearances, with her being a relatively early boot, she was still able to take control of the Heroes tribe, being the main strategist for the majority alliance, while also being a major swing vote early on. I think the problem is that, again, CIRIE comes into the season with such a massive target, with both JT and Tom clearly wanting to target her, and JT ending up being successful in doing so. But again, that was due to an idol play where CIRIE didn't even get the majority of the votes on her, and I don't think there's a way for them to even get the majority of the votes on her, which again is another impressive element of CIRIE's game. So again, for me, it's like CIRIE just continually gets screwed over, but continually shows that she can have impressive performances time after time, which continues to boost her on this list, despite the fact that she has not won. And to me, at this point in Survivor history, it would be enough for her to land here at number 3. Now, number 2, we're moving on to a player that might be controversial. And I will say that I think this person would have been number 1 before Heroes vs. Villains, because this is a person that was actually added to the list here. But after Heroes vs. Villains, they probably go down slightly, and another person also goes up. But still, I think it's more flack than they deserve for the Heroes vs. Villains game. And at number 2, we do have JT. And again, for me, I think JT would have been number 1 after Tocantins. I think his Tocantins game is really, really strong, to the point where, like, obviously people are like giving up their games for him. And while his end game, particularly his last couple rounds, is a bit rocky, where he debatably needs to win final 2 immunities, I think that also adds credence to him as a player, with how he is also solid physically. And he is a master at journey management on this season, with how he's able to so easily turn votes away from Steven, and how he handles Steven at Final Tribal, to where he ends up making Steven look kind of like a doofus there. He obviously expertly navigates through the game with Steven, and while I do think I would give more of the strategic credit to Steven, I definitely don't think JT is any slouch either. Again, it is a near perfect game across the season of Tocantins that I think, coming into Heroes vs. Villains, I think he once again does play pretty well for the majority of it. Where again, despite the fact that he plays a lot more aggressively, he's still able to be really well positioned coming into the merge. I mean, he is someone that is able to pull off this CIRIE blindside, this massive move, and single-handedly flipping over to Tom and Colby in order to blindside CIRIE, only to flip back and still be welcomed back into his original alliance, with him seemingly having the numbers had they gone to another tribal, with both Rupert and Colby seemingly being more on his side than Amanda, who would have been his opposition at that point, and with also Candace being an easy boot at that. So again, like, he's still in a very solid position there, and like, obviously you do have to knock him for the move to give the idol to Russell, but I also like get his rationale for doing so. Again, he literally just saw Parvati lead an all-women's alliance to completely dominate Survivor Micronesia. So that was very top of mind. I get why he assumed that the same thing was happening on the Villains tribe. And while I do think, obviously, handing his idol over was a bit of a misguided notion, especially when he could have just played the idol at the merge, to me it's not enough to detract from the rest of the game, where, again, like, if he had been successful in that, he probably wins the game. Like, he's in a very strong position to win the season had that move been successful. Like, people compare this move to like what Sandra does in Heroes vs. Villains, and to me it's two completely different things. Where to me, Sandra handing her idol to Denise has no upside to it. Like, there's no reason for her to do it outside of her trying to make good TV, I guess. And I guess trying to gain some leverage with Denise, but all it does is like slightly better her position if things go right. Well, with JT, he like, again, pretty much wins the game with the move. So it's a much better risk in my eyes for JT to be making that doesn't detract from him as a player, really, in the grand scheme of things. And to me, he had two very solid performances back to back here, with one of them being an all-time great performance. And because of that, JT ends up landing here at number 2. Now, number 1, again, this is a person that would have gotten bumped up after Heroes Villains, just enough to edge out JT to me. At number 1, we do have Parvati. And again, I think Parvati played well on Heroes vs. Villains. Again, I've been a big proponent of this. I think Parvati's Heroes vs. Villains game is very overrated, especially like her biggest move of the season of her double idol play. But I will say that, again, like I was obviously already high on Parvati after Micronesia. And while like I do have many holes with her Micronesia game, I do think the strength of her Cook Islands game led to her being a very solid player. But like here now with Heroes vs. Villains, her having 3 appearances and not getting worse than 6th place, with her getting the final tribal twice, like that is an insane record, with her also having played solid games to back that up. Again, she has a game in Cook Islands where if she had gotten to the end, she wins the game and was also in a position to get to the end had it not been for Yule flipping the game at final 9. Obviously, she wins Micronesia, and like while I have holes here and there, it's like she does form the Black Widow Brigade and builds this power structure that allows her to get to the end. And then here on Heroes vs. Villains, she has to play the game pretty much from the bottom for the majority of it, and is still able to scrap her way through to the end while also making big moves along the way. Like, again, to me, like, this is a very impressive resume. That while I do have issues with the resume throughout it, again, her allowing CIRIE to get to 3 and wanting to go to the end of CIRIE in Micronesia, her potentially being a first boot on Micronesia had they gone to Tribal. You have her needing to win Final 5, Final 6 immunities on Heroes vs. Villains. You have her losing Danielle at the Final 7 because she couldn't manage her relationship with Russell well enough. And really, like, her entire management of her relationship with Russell throughout the post-merge is very faulty, largely stemming from the double idol play. The fact that she needs Russell to use the idol on her during the Tyson boot, again, is another knock. Again, there are a lot of knocks along the way, but again, she's had 3 really deep runs, something at this point in Survivor history no one else has had to quite her level. Again, her and Amanda are relatively close, but again, like Parvati has a win over Amanda. I also feel like the non-finalist performance that Parvati has in Cook Islands is stronger than Amanda's in Heroes vs. Villains. And really, the fact that she is also a winner is the final piece of the puzzle to me that really solidifies Parvati as the best player after Heroes vs. Villains. But there we go. I mean, that is my top 10 players immediately after Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. Now, again, I do have one more video in this series that I do plan on doing down the road, where I think it will be top 10 players immediately after Survivor Cambodia, but I haven't locked that in just yet. So again, things could change, but stay tuned for that. Obviously, more Survivor Big Brother videos down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.